The backyard was filled with the warm glow of string lights and the smoky, savory scent of a summer BBQ. Friends and family laughed, clinking glasses, their faces flushed from laughter and drinks. She remembered how she'd held herself a little too close to her husband's best friend Rick over the course of the night, but no one seemed to notice, not even her husband Mark, who was cheerfully grilling burgers and chatting about the game on Saturday. But that all changed with one careless confession. Hey, I'm the one who got you pregnant, remember? Right there on your wedding night, no less, Rick had said with a casual chuckle, his arm looped comfortably around her waist. A few nearby guests paused, expressions uncertain, perhaps wondering if it was a joke or if they'd misheard. But her husband hadn't missed a word. The silence that followed was as thick as smoke. Mark's face was frozen, his spatula clutched in one hand, as if he'd been sculpted in bronze mid-motion. He looked at her, then at Rick, his best friend since grade school, his partner in all the important moments of his life. Mark didn't say anything, his face pale and unreadable. Without another word, he walked inside, the screen door snapping shut behind him. No one saw him after that. A month later, the doorbell rang. She hadn't heard from Mark since that night. Her attempts to call or find him had gone unanswered. His family, his friends, everyone was silent, an iron wall between her and the man she'd married. Rick opened the door to find Mark standing on the front step, his face a cold, expressionless mask. Beside him stood their 3-year-old twins, each clutching a small bag. Behind them, an old friend's pickup truck sat with every piece of furniture, every box, every trace of the life they'd shared. Mark handed over a white envelope, and Rick took it automatically, glancing between his old friend and the kids. Inside, Mark handed him a stack of papers. Papers Rick would later discover were certified DNA test results. Everything matches, Mark said evenly. His voice was low, calm, as if he were reciting a grocery list. They're yours. Rick opened his mouth to speak, but Mark held up a hand, cutting him off. This is it, Mark continued, his voice almost mechanical. I'm washing my hands of this. They're your kids, your responsibility. You two can figure it out. Her mouth dropped open. The children, confused, looked between the 3 adults, sensing something they couldn't yet understand. She wanted to reach out to Mark, to grab his arm, to tell him it hadn't been like that she hadn't meant for it to happen, that it had been a mistake. But he was already gone, walking back to the truck. He climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without a backward glance. Rick and the children were silent as the truck disappeared into the distance. He held the DNA test in his hand like it was a sentence, handed down by someone more powerful than himself, more relentless and unforgiving. It was only then that she realized the full depth of her betrayal, the finality of it, the irrevocable shift in all their lives. Mark had drawn his line, and she was on the other side, stranded with the man who had once been her lover and was now, in every way that mattered, her jailer. Rick's eyes darkened, and a slow, almost possessive smile crossed his face as he looked at her, then down at the children. She shuddered, feeling the walls close in. In the weeks that followed, Mark vanished as thoroughly as if he'd been swallowed by the earth. She tried to find him, desperate to understand what had been going through his mind that day, desperate to salvage some fragment of the life they'd built. But every attempt, calls, texts, emails, was met with cold silence. Even his family, once warm and welcoming, turned her away with frosty politeness. It was Rick's place now. She lived in his house, under his roof, alongside her children. No, their children now. And Rick took to his new role with unsettling ease. He was suddenly ever present, his tone authoritative, even possessive. As if her life was a chessboard he controlled piece by piece. He wanted her at his side, wanted her obedience. The affair they'd once had, thrilling and secretive, now felt like an iron shackle. One evening, as she sat in the kitchen trying to hold back tears while the kids slept upstairs, the door crashed open with a sharp bang that echoed through the house. She jumped to her feet, fear and hope mingling in her chest. But as the figure stepped through the doorway, she saw that it wasn't a memory. It was Mark, standing there in the dim light, his expression a storm of emotions. Mark looked different. Gone was the friendly, soft-spoken man she'd married. His jaw was clenched, his eyes hard as stone, and his presence filled the room like an approaching thunderstorm. He seemed bigger somehow, his posture rigid and unyielding, as if he'd returned forged in something colder and sharper. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Rick stepped into the doorway behind her, leaning casually against the doorframe, as if the sudden visit didn't faze him in the slightest. "Mark," he drawled, a smug smile crossing his face. "Didn't think you'd actually come back." Mark's gaze was locked onto Rick like a hawk sighting prey. "I didn't come for you," he said, his voice low and razor sharp. "Where are my kids?" Rick chuckled, crossing his arms. "They're not your kids, remember?" He lifted the DNA results from the counter and held them up, waving them tauntingly. "You handed them over. They're mine now. So is she. So is everything you left behind." Mark took a single, deliberate step forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you think I'm leaving my kids here with you, you're dead wrong." A muscle in Rick's jaw twitched, but he held his ground. "You can't just barge in here and take them. Legally, they're mine." He tilted his head, a smirk curving his lips. "But hey, if you want to fight about it, we could settle this like old times." Without waiting for an answer, Rick swung a punch, aimed straight for Mark's face. But Mark had anticipated it. He sidestepped, catching Rick's arm and twisting it behind his back with brutal force. Rick let out a strangled curse, struggling, but Mark didn't let up. His grip was vice-like, his movements controlled, precise, as if he'd been holding back for years and was finally letting go. "Was this what you wanted?" Mark hissed, his voice a deadly whisper as he wrenched Rick's arm further, a grim smile ghosting over his face. "My life, my family, my kids," Rick sneered, breathless with pain. "They wanted me, Mark. They don't need you." The words hit like a match to dry kindling. Mark's expression darkened, and in one swift move, he shoved Rick forward, sending him crashing against the wall. Rick staggered but straightened, his eyes blazing with rage. He charged, and they collided, fists flying in a tangle of brute force. Furniture shattered, dishes clattered to the floor, the house itself seeming to shake with the force of their struggle. "Stop it, both of you!" she cried, her voice shrill as she tried to pull them apart. But they barely registered her presence. Mark's face was bruised, blood trickling from his mouth. But he had the upper hand, and Rick knew it. Each time Rick swung, Mark dodged, his movements fluid and merciless, as if he'd been preparing for this moment, waiting for the chance to unleash all the fury he'd held back. Every punch he landed was an exclamation point on years of betrayal, a lifetime of trust shattered. Finally, Mark slammed Rick into the counter, his hand tightening around his throat. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on what doesn't belong to you," he spat. "You think you can just take my family, take my life like it's a prize?" Rick choked, his face going pale, his eyes flickering with panic. "They're mine," he gasped out, his voice hoarse. "You gave them to me." Mark's eyes were cold, unwavering. He didn't loosen his grip. "You think I'd leave my kids with someone like you? You think I'd walk away without a plan?" He leaned in closer, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "That DNA test doesn't change a thing. You've lost." With one final shove, he released Rick, letting him collapse onto the floor, coughing and gasping for breath. He turned to her, his expression hard, unyielding. "Pack a bag," he said quietly, his gaze flickering to her, then up the stairs where their children slept. "We're leaving tonight." She stood frozen, heart pounding as Mark's words echoed in the wrecked kitchen. Rick was still gasping for breath on the floor, a defeated, angry heap at Mark's feet. But Mark's gaze was fixed on her, his command unyielding. This was no request. It was an ultimatum. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her mind spinning. She didn't know whether to feel relief, fear, or regret. This man standing before her was different, unrecognizable from the soft-spoken husband she'd known. His presence was overwhelming, intense, a force that filled the room with a sense of finality. "Get moving," Mark said, voice steady, "or I'll pack for you." Swallowing hard, she nodded, too shaken to argue. She hurried up the stairs, her mind a whirlwind of emotion and dread. She could hear Rick cursing below, his voice hoarse and faint as he tried to recover. But he didn't dare come after them. Mark's presence, his sheer will, had become an invisible barrier that Rick wouldn't dare cross. She crept into the children's room, gently waking the twins. They blinked up at her with sleepy confusion, rubbing their eyes as she whispered reassurances and slipped them into jackets, glancing back at the doorway where Mark waited, silent and unyielding. The kids clung to her, sensing the tension but too young to understand the chaos raging around them. Once she'd bundled a few belongings into a duffel bag, she led the children downstairs, each step heavy with the weight of the unknown. Mark was standing by the door, his jaw tight, every line of his body radiating a quiet, resolute fury. He took the bag from her without a word, shouldering it with a practiced efficiency. She realized then, looking at the grim set of his face, that this wasn't a spontaneous decision. He'd planned this meticulously, down to every last detail. Rick had pulled himself up, clutching his bruised ribs, a spiteful glint in his eye as he watched them from across the room. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice rough. "You think you can just take them and walk out?" Mark's eyes flicked over him, cold and unreadable. "You're done, Rick. You don't belong in their lives, or hers." "Oh, I think they disagree," Rick sneered, taking a shaky step forward. "You think they'll forget me? You think she will?" His voice was laced with mockery, a final desperate taunt. "She chose me, not you." But Mark didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to Rick, lowering his voice to a barely audible whisper, his words chillingly calm. "You'll stay away, or I'll make sure you regret ever meeting me." His tone carried a steely edge, a dark promise that needed no elaboration. Rick paled, the defiance in his eyes wavering. He knew better than anyone how far Mark was willing to go, especially when protecting those he cared about. And now, stripped of every last piece of leverage, Rick seemed smaller, a mere shadow of the man who had once been his closest friend. Without another word, Mark turned, ushering her and the children outside into the cold night. They piled into his car, and as they drove away, she couldn't help but glance back at Rick's house, the glow of the porch light shrinking in the rearview mirror, until it was swallowed by darkness. It felt like the closing of a door, a chapter sealing shut forever. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the night pressing in around them. The kids had fallen asleep in the back seat, their small bodies slumped in peaceful oblivion. She watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of guilt and relief. Mark's eyes stayed fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression an impenetrable mask. Finally, he pulled off onto a quiet, unpaved road, leading to a secluded cabin surrounded by dense woods. The air was cold, crisp with the scent of pine. He parked, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring into the distance. She could feel the tension in him, the storm beneath his calm exterior, and for the first time since they'd left Rick's house, she dared to speak. "Mark, what happens now?" Her voice trembled slightly, a vulnerable echo in the silence. Mark looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. For a moment, he said nothing, and she thought he might lash out, let loose the anger that had been simmering behind his calm facade. But he only sighed, running a hand over his face, the hardness slipping away just a little, revealing the exhaustion beneath. "You're staying here," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "With the kids. You're safe here." "Safe?" She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Safe from what? From Rick? Or from you?" His jaw clenched, a flash of hurt flickering in his eyes. "From him," he said, his voice harsh, as if the words cost him something. I won't have him anywhere near you or the kids. I don't care what it takes." "But you left us with him," she said, the accusation slipping out before she could stop it. "You left, and you gave us to him." Mark's face hardened, and he looked away, a muscle in his jaw ticking. "I did what I thought was right," he muttered, his tone defensive. "I didn't know how far he'd gone, not until I saw those results." "But they're still yours, Mark. They're your children," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And I'm still your wife. I know what I did was wrong. Stop." His voice was a quiet command, and she fell silent, swallowing the rest of her words. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering himself, then looked at her, his gaze steady, but filled with an edge of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "This isn't about us," he said, his voice rough. It's about them. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Whatever it takes to make sure they never have to know that. Man. She looked at him, studying the weariness, the pain that lurked beneath the surface of his anger. For a moment, she thought she saw a glimpse of the man she'd married, the man who had loved her once. But he seemed a stranger now, someone forged by betrayal and regret. I won't ask you to forgive me, she whispered, the words falling between them like fragile glass. But I'll never stop trying to make it right. Mark's expression softened just a fraction. I don't want apologies. I want peace for them. That's all I care about now. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a manila envelope. There's enough money in here to start fresh. I have a place set up for you, a friend's place where no one will find you. You and the kids can stay there as long as you need. Her throat tightened, realization sinking in. You're not coming with us, are you? Mark shook his head, his gaze dropping. I've got unfinished business to handle first. His tone was final, unyielding. She felt the weight of his words, the sense of a goodbye unspoken. But there was no time for protest, no room for reconciliation. He had made his choice, and she could see that no words would change his mind. He got out of the car, lifting the sleeping children from the back seat and carrying them inside the cabin. She followed, watching him tuck them in with a gentleness that felt like a promise and a farewell. When he looked up, his eyes met hers one last time, his expression unreadable, a complicated mix of resentment and something that might have been forgiveness, or perhaps resignation. Goodbye, he said quietly, his voice almost tender. And with that, he turned and left, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her with the children, the cabin, and the fragile remains of what they'd once been. In the weeks following Mark's departure, the remote cabin felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. She was left alone with her thoughts, haunted by memories of the life she'd shattered and the man who had once been her best friend. Days blurred together in an endless loop of caring for the children and struggling to adjust to her exile. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something darker loomed in the background. One cold morning, while the kids played outside, she received a letter, hand-delivered, left at the doorstep without a sound. She opened it with trembling hands, knowing instinctively who it was from. It was Mark's handwriting, brief and to the point. Rick won't be bothering you again. Keep looking over your shoulder, though. That's your life now. A shiver ran down her spine as she read it. What did he mean? What had he done? Mark, meanwhile, had moved through the past few weeks with meticulous intent, dismantling everything Rick held dear. After that night at Rick's house, he had set to work with ruthless precision. The memories of Rick's betrayal were etched into his mind, fueling him through the long nights, pushing him forward without a shred of mercy. He knew Rick's business dealings, his finances, his personal vices. Years of friendship had given him access to every one of Rick's vulnerabilities. Mark was systematic, a quiet storm that dismantled his former friend's world, one piece at a time. It began with the finances. He called in every debt, manipulating their mutual contacts, slipping information to certain clients that made Rick look unstable, unreliable. Rick's business began to bleed, deals slipping through his fingers like sand. Unbeknownst to Rick, Mark had been planting seeds with his business partners, ensuring that trust in him would erode. Whispers of fraud and backdoor deals circulated, gaining momentum. But that wasn't enough. Mark wanted Rick broken in more than just the bank. He wanted him shattered. So he turned to something even deeper, something he knew would cut Rick to the core. One night, Mark left a trail of damning evidence at the office of a local investigator, suggesting that Rick had been involved in illegal schemes, accusations that were sure to catch law enforcement's attention. Then, he waited, patiently watching from the shadows, as Rick's life crumbled. Within weeks, Rick was facing a relentless legal battle. His assets were frozen, his reputation obliterated. The friends he'd relied on, who had once idolized him, now turned their backs, repulsed by the swirling rumors and criminal charges. And through it all, he didn't see Mark's hand moving the pieces, not until it was too late. One night, as Rick sat alone in his empty office, surrounded by files and stacks of papers he could no longer control, the door creaked open. Mark stepped inside, his presence cold and menacing, his silhouette backlit by the dim hall lights. He looked at Rick with an eerie calm, the faintest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. What did you do?" Rick stammered, his voice thick with disbelief. "How could you—" Mark's gaze was steel, unwavering. "How could I?" he said quietly, venom lacing his words. "You betrayed me. You took everything from me, and you thought you'd walk away unscathed?" Rick stumbled back, his face pale. "I'll rebuild. You haven't won. I'll find a way out of this." Mark's lip twitched in a mocking half-smile. "You still think this is just about money, don't you? You're a fool. This is far from over." Rick tried to keep his composure, but Mark's presence, his calm ruthlessness, cut deeper than any financial ruin. There was a finality in Mark's tone that made him feel like he was sinking into quicksand, every escape route closed. "But you didn't have to ruin everything." Rick's voice rose in desperation. "We were friends." "We were friends," Mark interrupted coldly, his voice barely a whisper, "until you decided that friendship meant taking my wife and claiming my children as your own." His expression hardened, darkened with something almost primal. "You thought you could steal what's mine and be rewarded for it." Rick was silent, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. With slow, deliberate movements, Mark pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and dropped it onto the desk in front of Rick. Rick glanced at it, reluctant to touch it, but Mark's cold stare compelled him. His hands shook as he opened it and pulled out a series of photographs, each more damning than the last. They were of his previous deals, of every dirty move he'd made over the years, all meticulously documented. Some he'd even forgotten about, but Mark hadn't. "Take a good look," Mark said, his voice deadly calm. "If you fight this, these go public. I'll make sure you never work in this town again. In fact, I'll make sure you never work anywhere again." Rick's face drained of all color as he thumbed through the photos. He looked up, desperation clouding his eyes. "Mark, please," he begged. I'll leave. I'll leave town. You'll never see me again, I swear." Mark tilted his head, regarding Rick with a disdainful smirk. "You don't get to make promises anymore. You'll leave, but you'll do it my way. You'll disappear from the city, from the state, and you'll never so much as look at my family again." Rick nodded, barely able to keep from shaking. "I understand. I'll go." Mark's lips curved in a cold, humorless smile. "I'm glad we understand each other." He stepped back, eyes gleaming with grim satisfaction as he took one last look at the man who'd once been his closest friend. "And if you ever come back, if you even think about them, well, you know what I'm capable of." Without another word, Mark turned and strode from the office, his steps echoing in the silence. He left Rick standing there alone, surrounded by the remnants of his ruined life, knowing that this was no temporary setback. Mark had ensured it was a permanent, crushing defeat. Back at the cabin, she never received another word from Rick. No calls, no letters, nothing but silence. As the weeks stretched into months, she knew Mark's threat had been real. Rick was gone for good, vanished like a ghost. And though the peace was a small comfort, it came at a cost. She knew Mark's vengeance hadn't been for her, or even for himself. It had been for the children, a bitter, twisted form of protection that left her feeling both grateful and devastated. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she received one final letter from Mark, postmarked from a city far away. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding as she read the single sentence inside. "For them, I will always be watching." It wasn't a promise. It was a sentence, a permanent reminder that while Mark had disappeared, he hadn't truly gone. Somewhere, in the shadowed corners of their lives, he would always be there, an invisible protector and a lingering threat, bound by the injustice that had turned him from husband to avenger. Years passed in a strange, quiet peace. Mark's presence lingered in the background of her life, hauntingly absent, but still powerfully felt. He was like a shadow that touched everything, each moment, each decision, even though he never reached out again after that last letter. She had tried to move on, even settled into a new life in a town far removed from the past. The children grew, blissfully unaware of the tangled darkness that had defined their early years. To them, Mark was only a distant figure, a name that brought a flicker of confusion when someone mentioned Dad. But she carried his memory like a weight on her soul, a penance she bore alone. Then, one rainy evening, she noticed something strange. She was returning from the grocery store, the kids chattering away as they ran up the steps to the small, cozy house they now called home. As she fumbled for her keys, she saw it, a sleek black car parked down the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. She glanced around, her pulse quickening, a familiar dread tightening in her chest. The car lingered for hours, disappearing only when the rain turned into a downpour that washed the streets clean. But the next day, it was back again. At first, she tried to ignore it, dismissing it as paranoia. Yet the car would appear day after day, always just out of reach, like a specter haunting her routine. Her heart would pound each time she saw it. Memories of that final night with Mark resurfacing in her mind, a question gnawing at her. Had he come back? One afternoon, unable to bear it any longer, she marched down the street toward the car, heart hammering in her chest. She wanted answers. She needed to know if this was Mark, if he'd finally returned to reclaim the life they'd once had. But as she approached, the car started. The engine's low growl filled the air as the car pulled away, leaving her standing in the street, drenched from the afternoon mist. She watched it disappear around the corner, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen, at least not by her. 2 weeks later, a package arrived on her doorstep. It was a plain brown box, sealed tightly with no return address. Her hand shook as she brought it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. The kids were at school and the house was silent, the only sound her own shallow breathing as she stared at the box. She opened it slowly, peeling back the tape. Inside, she found a stack of files, each marked with a different date and location. Her heart skipped as she flipped through them. Photos of Rick in various cities across the country, each image documenting his attempts to restart his life. There were records of his finances, detailing every failed business venture, every severed tie. Each page told a story of his descent into ruin, methodically orchestrated with the precision of a vendetta that refused to die. At the bottom of the box was a single letter, written in Mark's sharp, meticulous handwriting. You may have forgiven him, but I haven't. He will never escape, and neither will you. Her breath hitched. There was no anger in the words, no passion, just a cold promise, an assertion of control that reminded her of how thoroughly Mark had dismantled their lives. She realized then that she'd never be free, not really. Mark had moved on, but he hadn't let go. Somewhere out there, he watched from afar, pulling strings she couldn't see, ensuring that Rick's life remained in ruins. And in doing so, he kept her bound to him, a silent witness to the destruction he had unleashed. She burned the files, each page curling in on itself, as the flames licked them into ash. But the memory of what she'd seen lingered, a reminder that Mark's vengeance was woven into the fabric of her existence, an inescapable thread that bound them together. Even now, as she tucked her children into bed each night, she felt his invisible hand in her life, a dark guardian watching over them with an unyielding sense of duty and retribution. He would never be part of their lives in the way a father should be, but he would always be there, watching, waiting, reminding her that the past was never truly gone. And so, she lived on, bound to an unbreakable tether, always looking over her shoulder, knowing that somewhere, Mark lingered just out of sight, as much a part of her life now as he had been in the beginning. And though she'd never see him again, she knew that he'd be there, lurking in the shadows until the end.